Hi there, this is part one of an 8-part series on thinking maps. This part is going to cover circle maps and their variations. My name is Eric Lovein, and I've been a 5th grade teacher at Richard E. Haynes Elementary School here in OMSD for about 25 years. This is my first year as a spotlight teacher, and I'm a big fan of thinking maps and right from the beginning. And so my blog and my webpage on the Spotlight website and this series of professional development videos will cover thinking maps and everything else that I do with them over time. It's going to take a while because there are 8 different maps and there are a whole lot of things you can do with them. If you have any questions about anything you've read in my blog or anything you see on my website, or anything you see here in this video, please feel free to email me any questions. My district email address is there. We're going to go ahead and begin. So the really important thing about thinking maps, and the reason I think they're so essential, is that I feel like they're the best tool at my disposal for teaching my kids about how they learn and how they think. And that's a really big goal of mine, to make sure my kids are able to discuss what they are doing with their brains or what other people are asking them to do with their brains. And so thinking maps give me the opportunity to do that, like I said. And so when we talk about thinking maps, while each map has a name like circle map, bubble map, flow map, etc., what's really important about each map is the type of thinking that is required to complete the map. And so the circle map is about defining in context. And I think that's a really interesting point, because I think most people who think about thinking maps either think of them as brainstorming maps, or if they do understand what type of thinking is involved, they usually just talk about the defining part. And while it is very important to teach kids how to define something or what it means to define something, I want you to remember the context part as well, because understanding what context is will not only help them be successful in completing circle maps, but it will also help them with a lot of the other maps they're going to do. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So these are my own imperfect definitions of these 2 important words. First of all, defining is providing all relevant information about a topic that you've been asked to define. Context would be like the parameters of that definition, that determine the relevance of the information. So in other words, the example for defining that I like to use is Wikipedia. If you're looking up the Revolutionary War on Wikipedia, you're going to find an enormous amount of information. And so if you ask someone to define the Revolutionary War, it's just too big of a question, right? And so even Wikipedia realizes that. And so they break the information into the different little sections at the top that you can click to if you want. And so I kind of think of that as like the context. So, if I ask you to define a certain element or a certain aspect of the Revolutionary War, I'm making your job a lot easier, right? And so when it comes to context, obviously what we mean is just in what situation are you trying to define whatever it is you're defining. And so I always use this example of your colleague. So you must have at least one colleague, probably many colleagues with whom you're pretty close at work. And so we'll just take that hypothetical colleague as an example. Let's say she is obviously a teacher, or has some other position at the school. She's a mother, she's a wife, she's your friend. Maybe she is a rock climber, it's one of her hobbies. And so if someone asks you to define that friend, that colleague, there would be a lot of information you could provide, and too much probably to fit in one circle map. And so I could make that job a lot easier for you by giving you some sort of context within which you're going to define her. So if I said, define her as a teacher, now you can clear away all of the information you have about her as a mother and a rock climber and such, and just focus on that one aspect. So that's a really important thing for students to understand when they're doing a thinking map, is they don't necessarily have to put in every last bit of information. They just want to put in the information that is relevant to the particular context. All right, so another really big thing to understand about circle maps is that circle maps are not a text organization structure, but that's cool. We're glad for that. We need some maps that are not text organization structures. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I have these terms I like to use with my kids when we're talking about close reading, and I differentiate between the purpose of the writing that they're looking at, particularly if it's expository writing. These are all the different categories of expository writing that are identified by right from the beginning. So, every piece of writing you're going to read has a purpose, but it also has a structure. And I actually use the word method with my kids. So there's a purpose for the writing, and there's also a method the author is employing to organize their writing, right? And so one thing I like to point out about reporting information by defining is that it is a purpose, but it's not a method. You can intend to define something in your writing, but you will not use definition as an organization structure, because it isn't. A circle map is not a text organization structure. The reason for that is that a circle map is round. There aren't any corners. You can't put one piece of information in one corner and another piece of information in another corner, and you're not even really intended to do that. You just put it wherever it goes, because you're just trying to get information out of your head and onto the page. You can always take that information and organize it better with another map later on. So there's a lot of writing. A lot of the things I'm going to be sharing here are straight from the Thinking Maps manual, and I highly recommend that you get your hands on one of those if you don't already have one laying around, because it's got a lot of great information. And so the first thing you need to know about a circle map is how it is constructed. I'm sure a lot of you watching this video know the basics of how circle maps work. I would encourage you to stick around though, because I will eventually be getting into some things that maybe you hadn't considered before. So the way you draw a circle map is you draw a small circle inside of a larger circle. And in the inner circle, you're going to put the topic that will be defined. And you can represent, it could be a person, a place, an idea, an object, and you can represent that in a variety of ways. You'll see kindergartners and first graders often will use pictures in the middle circle, to represent what it is they're going to be defining. And then the larger outside circle, you're going to write the information about that topic that is relevant contextually, right? So defining, basically. Now, in some cases, like I said before, circle maps are used for brainstorming. And so kids will often just write anything that comes to mind that is related to whatever topic they're supposed to be brainstorming. And so it says, if the circle map is used for brainstorming, write words or ideas in the outside circle that come to mind about the topic in the center. So we'll talk about how, sometimes circle maps can be great tools for measuring how much prior knowledge students have on the topic. It says, as the context for an idea changes, so may the information in the outside of the circle map. That's another point I was trying to make earlier, that you could have 4 different circle maps about the same exact topic and have very different information in each depending upon the context, right? So here's a quick construction of a circle map, pretty basic, pretty simple. I won't waste your time talking about that in more detail. So one thing that does seem to confuse people sometimes is how a circle map differs from a bubble map. They're very different from a thinking standpoint. They may have similarities from a structural standpoint, given that they both have a bunch of roundness to them. But really, a circle map is for defining, a bubble map is for describing. So a bubble map is very limited in what you're allowed to write in the bubbles around the main bubble in the map. You're only supposed to use adjectives and adjective phrases, and the whole purpose should just be to simply describe something. Whereas with a circle map, it's a lot more open. You can put any relevant information, whether it's descriptive information or just, dates, numbers, anything that comes to mind is allowed to go into a circle map. And you might think, why are there these strict rules to what can go in each map? Well, we're trying to teach kids to differentiate between these types of thinking. So it's not so much that there are rules to the map, it's that there are rules to thinking, and that's what we really want them to learn. So with any of these maps, there are key words, and my way of defining what key words are is just words that the kids are going to come across in writing prompts, in questions, in textbooks that are going to prompt them to do this type of thinking. So if they see words like context, list, define, obviously, tell everything you know, brainstorm, identify, relate prior knowledge, tell about, explore the meaning, discuss, associate, generate. All of these are really great thinking words, by the way, and they're also words that hopefully would eventually lead kids to understand, hey, I need to make a circle map in order to do this. And so that's one of my goals as a teacher, is that my kids start to know this language and they can identify what type of thinking is being asked of them based upon these keywords and such. There are also a lot of questions that they might come across, more, broader questions that would also, clue them into the idea that they're being asked to define. So, they're being asked about context clues, or what they already know about something, or how they would define something, or, what information they would include in a brainstorm, or what they think something means. All of those questions are probably prompting them to generate a circle map. Now, if you've kept up with my blog on the Spotlight Teacher website or Blogspot, then I've recently been working on a series about the metacognitive frames of reference. And I encourage you to go take a look at that if you aren't familiar with it already. But there are 3 frames of reference: the green, blue, and red frames of reference. I'm not going to get into that in a lot of detail here. Like I said, you can certainly take a look at the blog, but these are all frame of reference questions that pertain to circle maps. How do you know this information? Anytime somebody completes a circle map, they can answer that question after they're done. Where are they getting the information? That might be a question they want to ask before they even complete the map. What sources did you reference to gather your information? Same sort of question. Is there a specific point of view that is influencing your definition? And so, like I said, I personally think that's a blue frame of reference question, but I also think that's just a context question. Obviously, if the teacher has already told them ahead of time that they want them, to define their mother as a mother, not as an employee at their work or anything else, but just focus on the aspects of their mother that pertain to her motherhood, then that is a point of view. That's a context in and of itself. It says, why is this information important? That's a red frame question. What have you learned from this defining or brainstorming? Also red frame. And what is your background experience? What in your background experiences is influencing your ideas? So that's another blue frame question that has to do with their own point of view, and the idea that perhaps some of the information they've put into this circle map has been influenced by who they are. So one little map I made up for my colleagues here at Haynes at some point, just as a little rudimentary exercise in working on the frames of reference, was just this simple circle map with some frame of reference questions on the side. Very basic, general questions that could be asked about any particular map they happen to be working on. And so, I have a lot of these things available. I've started posting some of my work on my webpage. I have a bunch of thinking map templates that you can get access to by clicking the link on my webpage, and you can make things like this yourself. This is a pretty basic one, but like I said, it's a nice little exercise if what you really want to do is teach the kids about the frames of reference. Key information. So, as I said before, thinking map or circle maps are used for brainstorming without actually making connections. So in other words, the kids aren't trying to think about whether the information they're brainstorming would fit into various categories or could be compared to other information. They're just trying to get it out onto the page, onto the map, and they can worry about connecting it later. Very often, and we'll talk about this in a little while, circle maps are used in combination with other maps because they're like a starter map. They can contain keywords, phrases, descriptors, and illustrations. So like I said, especially younger kids, if they want to draw things as opposed to writing words, that's totally acceptable. It says it can be used to assess prior knowledge before teaching. That's a great idea. If you just want to see how much kids already know about a topic, they can just make a quick circle map. It can walk around and notice what they do know or what they don't. And they can be used as an anticipatory set, same kind of idea. All right, just get the lesson rolling by getting them thinking about what they already know. And then students can use it to self-assess by comparing before and after maps. So you could have them literally make the same circle map twice before and after the lesson to compare how much fuller their circle maps are at the end of the lesson. So, I talked about this, but, some of the applications are vocabulary development. You can do a vocabulary circle map in one of two ways. You can start with the word in the middle and have them define the word on the outside, or if you're having them try to figure out what a word means in context, they could write a bunch of the context in the big circle on the outside, and then on the inner circle, try to figure out, the definition or something like that. can definitely be used to brainstorm, as I said. All of these things I kind of talked about on the previous page. Okay, this is a really big deal to me personally, because I would love someday to be able to teach all of my grammar through writing and through thinking maps. And so I always like to think about what grammatical, terms or rules I can teach while I'm also teaching a particular type of writing or teaching a particular type of thinking. And as I was explaining this to one of my colleagues, Matt Clark, one day, he brilliantly came up with the idea that with the circle map, the type of, or the grammatical, the part of speech that you could teach with a circle map would be appositives. Appositives are kind of, a slightly fancy part of grammar, but they were actually a fifth grade standard for years. And it's just when you basically interrupt yourself in the middle of a sentence to give more information about a noun that you're talking about. So a couple of examples would be like Radiohead, my favorite band, is playing at the Greek Theater. So my favorite band is an appositive. You're just stopping in the middle of the sentence to define it better. So that was Matt's point, that Radiohead could be in the middle of my circle map and my favorite band could be one of the pieces of information outside. Nancy, my friend's sister, loves Radiohead. So my friend's sister is another appositive. And again, something that you could put in a circle map while defining Nancy. So we'll get more into that as we get into some of the more sophisticated maps. But I do like that idea of going ahead and using circle maps to teach that part of speech. All right, let's look at some examples that I've made and some examples that I got from the Thinking Maps program itself. So this one is interesting. I think I made this one for a summer school class I was teaching. It was second grade, so this is more of a primary map. I believe I got this from the Reading Strategies Thinking Map book. It's a yellow book, and it's fantastic. I recommend that you get yourself a copy if you can, because it's got so many good ideas for how to teach reading strategies like predictions, inferences, making connections, questioning, all of those things. This one is obviously about making predictions, and there are some frames of reference on the outside of the circle. These are just like little hints that are going to influence what the kids put inside the bigger circle here. And so you can see, what do you already know about this beforehand can kind of go over in this area. What did you predict from the picture walk over here? What does the title make you predict, etc. Similarly, there's this other primary map I have that's about questioning, that has them asking themselves questions based upon some of their pre-reading as well. So this is a map I use with my fifth graders, and I do teach a reading class every day with some pretty advanced readers. Some of the maps you'll see that I use as examples are pretty sophisticated. This one is about making text-to-world connections, and specifically thinking about how aspects of character will help them make text-to-world connections. And so you can see what I've done here is this is actually a digital thinking map I would usually give them via Google Drawings. And so the kids can manipulate these maps by typing over any of the words that you see here. So what I always teach them is if I've written something in italics, they can go ahead and write over those things. They just highlight them and start typing. And also you'll notice that everything's sort of color coded. So the text evidence is in green, because if you look at my blog about the frames of reference, you'll know that green means, has to do with where you got your information. And you'll see some frame of reference questions at the bottom that are also color coded for the same reason. But what they basically do would on the outside here, they would tell us what text evidence caused them to make a text-to-world connection, and then the connection would go in here. So this is usually called a circle map with a frame of reference, because you can see it's been split up kind of like a target, so that it's a little more structured and organized than a regular circle map. And this one's kind of interesting too. This is what we call a reverse circle map. I kind of referred to this earlier, the idea that you first gather up information in the bigger circle and then write something in the middle, in this case, an inference about something. So that's an interesting way to use the circle map kind of in reverse. So here are just some content area examples. For instance, a social studies map about George Washington's farewell address. And you can see some frames of reference that are helping frame the thinking, helping the student think about what they should put in the map on the outside of the circle. Here is a science circle map about physical change. And these are examples I got from the thinking map manual, in case you're wondering. And so here is, interestingly, this one's for math, and you can see that the student has drawn some right triangles because, of course, if it's a visual thing, that it makes sense to draw the information visually. So one question you might have is, how do circle maps relate to the other 7 thinking maps? And I think, you know, they're pretty foundational. Obviously, they're kind of considered the first map, like the starter map. And so one thing I thought about a while ago is the idea that this notion of context that I talked about in the beginning can be applied to other maps as well. So for instance, when we get to bubble maps, you know, one of the frame of reference questions that you can easily ask about a bubble map is, what is the context? What is influencing this description? In other words, are you describing every last aspect of this person, or is there something about them that you're focusing on, like their appearance or something like that? Same thing with the double bubble map, you know, what caused you to compare these people, or from what standpoint? So again, if you go back to colleagues, you could compare 2 of your colleagues as teachers, but you could also choose something completely different to compare them, you know, about, like, as friend, you know, comparing them as friends or comparing them as parents or whatever it is. So you can always think about the context of whatever map you're doing. It doesn't have to just be about circle maps. And here, like I said, are combo maps. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because obviously these will make more sense to you once we've had a chance to cover the other maps, like the tree maps and the flow maps that you're going to see in these combos. But as I said before, you know, even if you did want to use defining as your purpose for writing, you would need to organize that definition. And so a tree map is often a really great way to do that, because you can, the student can be taught to look at the information in their circle map and start to group pieces of information into categories, into broader categories. It's a really healthy mental skill for them to develop, to, you know, see how certain pieces of information fit together and transfer that into a tree map that is now more structured. And so they can understand that the first branch of the tree map would be the first paragraph of an essay, etc. Combo map number 2 here, these are all straight from the Thinking Maps program, is the circle tree flow. Same kind of idea, just taking it to the next level and understanding that, you know, your categories are a sequence, and so they're being turned into a flow map. But you see, they still start this with a circle map because it's a good way to just get ideas down before you start getting highly organized like this. Another interesting one, and I don't know why this is backwards, but, you know, is 2 circle maps that you then turn into a double bubble map, which is for comparing and contrasting. So this combo map teaches you to use circle maps to think about each topic in isolation before you go ahead and start comparing. And I think that's a really good idea as well. Okay, so as we go along, these PDs will probably get a little more complex because some of the maps we'll talk about later on are a little meatier, but the circle map is a really great place to start. I actually think that it makes sense to teach these maps explicitly to your students and teach the thinking explicitly, and to talk about the type of thinking that is being done each time you use a circle map, so that the kids gain that awareness and that proficiency. All right. If you have any questions about anything you saw in the video or anything you see on my webpage or in my blogs, like I said before, please feel free to email me here at my district email address. And I hope you enjoyed, and look out for the next PD video about bubble maps. Thanks a lot. See you later.